All right, in a nod to old-time Rotary at the Spice of Life, and here, we're our speaker. We're at 1 o'clock. Thank you for bearing with me. You may have been reading a lot in the press recently about the explosion of research and on implications of the human microbiome in health and disease. Our guest speaker today hails from the University of Colorado, just like the last time we met here. Nothing personal, Dr. Christopher Lowry, and is on the cutting edge of this kind of research. Chris spoke to us 4 years ago, and we have such fond memories. We're welcoming him back today. Dr. Christopher Lowry.
So thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'd also like to thank Gary for bringing up the possibility to come back and speak to this group. And finally, I want to thank this group, the Rotarians, for all of the wonderful work that you're doing in our community here in Boulder. It's really apparent to me as an outsider attending this brief meeting today what incredible work that you're all doing, and I, for one, am very grateful for that. So, what is a microbiome? The microbiome is essentially the trillions of microorganisms that are living in and on our bodies. And some estimates suggest that there are more microorganism cells in and on our bodies than human cells. And so to really understand human biology, we need to start thinking of humans as ecosystems. And I'll come back to that idea later in the talk. So the other thing I want to define is health. And so this definition has withstood the test of time, originally proposed in 1948 by the World Health Organization. And you can see that they proposed 3 components of health: physical health, mental health, and social functioning. I'd like to give you a brief outline of the talk today. I'll start by talking about focusing on mental health, because that's really my area of expertise, understanding the relationship between the microbiome, what we call the microbiome-gut-brain axis, or how a bidirectional axis that allows the microbiome to communicate with the brain and therefore control our physiology, our behavior, and our mental health. But also introduce the idea of prevention of mental health, which is a particular focus of our research. Introduce you to something called the Hygiene Hypothesis, which was introduced in the 1970s. Something called the farm effect. It's been replicated so many times, it's now called the farm effect. And you'll hear more about that in a moment. And the relationship of these two things to psychiatric disorders. Then move on to the role of the microbiome-gut-brain axis in mental health, and talk about some future directions. So let's start with prevention of mental health as a concept. And so this quote is from a paper by Tom Insel, who was then the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. So he had a very important job directing mental health research in the United States, or at least government funding of that research. And he pointed out that we have a history in psychiatry of focusing on incremental and marketable advances in psychiatry. In other words, producing drugs that maybe have subtle modifications, but have high potential for profits. They then went on to say that rather than focusing on these incremental and marketable advances, we should be focusing on prevention of psychiatric disorders. So this idea of prevention of psychiatric disorders is not new. This paper came out over a decade ago, but we haven't made much progress. And so there's 2 questions. Why haven't we made much progress? And 2, what do we need to do to really make progress in terms of preventing mental health disorders? So the first question I'd like to ask is, if we want to achieve this aim of preventing mental health disorders, where do we start? And so we argue that we need to understand the risk factors for psychiatric disorders, and some of these risk factors are well understood. They include your genetic predisposition, so the DNA that you inherit from your parents. Obviously, there's not much we can do about that in terms of interventions. But also there are environmental influences that are important risk factors for mental health disorders, and that includes something called ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. This is one of the major risk factors for subsequent development of mental health disorders in adulthood. But I'd also like to argue today okay, how's that? You hear in the back? Great. Okay, so I'd like to argue that microbial inputs are also important environmental factors, and we don't often think of these inputs as being important for mental health, but that's really the message for today. Many of you are aware of how you feel if you get an infection. You don't feel very good. You get something called sickness behavior, fever, feel kind of sluggish, maybe cognition is impaired. That's the result of the induction of something called inflammation in your body that has those consequences on your brain function. In contrast to these types of bacterial inputs are other bacteria that you may not be as familiar with, and these are notable because they don't induce inflammation or sickness behavior or infection. On the contrary, they produce what we call anti-inflammatory effects. And so these types of microorganisms have evolved in a way, or co-evolved with mammals and humans, in a way that they are able to control inflammation and prevent inappropriate inflammation. And the idea here is if we don't have adequate exposure to these types of microorganisms, especially bacteria, then we're at risk for exaggerated or inappropriate inflammation, and subsequently at risk for conditions that are driven by inappropriate inflammation. So we call that a failure of immunoregulation, the failure of the immune system to regulate itself and terminate inappropriate inflammation, and that can lead to chronic low-grade inflammation and overt inflammatory disease. So now let's talk about the hygiene hypothesis, the farm effect, and their relationship to psychiatric disorders. First, I want to point out that we should all be very concerned living in a modern urban society. And that's because these overt inflammatory conditions have been increasing at dramatic levels since the 1950s. This includes things like type 1 diabetes, Crohn's disease, which is one of the inflammatory bowel diseases, multiple sclerosis, and recent evidence suggests that there may also be an increasing incidence of mental health disorders and suicide. So, what does a hygiene hypothesis have to do with all of this? So this hypothesis was developed and put forward in the 1970s by David Strachan. He was an immunologist, a British immunologist that lived in London. And he made the observation that if you had older siblings, you were less likely to get allergies or asthma as an adult. And this photograph in the upper right-hand corner could just as well be me and my two brothers. So I'm the middle child. My older brother, Tony, I remember when he was 10, he had these terrible allergies. We'd go to the farm and he'd just start sneezing, and I'm like, oh, I feel so sorry for my brother. That must be miserable. And then when I was about 16, when I went to the farm, I started sneezing. And I'm like, oh no, I feel sorry for myself. And then my youngest brother, Jay, never developed allergies. And this is exactly what you see at the national level when you look at what is called the birth order effect. If you're born first, you have the highest risk of allergies and asthma. If you're born second, you have a lower risk. If you're born third, you have an even lower risk, and it continues to provide protection over time. So why is that? David Strachan proposed that it's because when you have older siblings, you get sick more often. You get more infections. They bring home colds and bacterial infections from school, from preschool. And it's these infections that provide this protection. We no longer believe that that's really accurate. We think that, yes, infections are important, so we're not discarding his original ideas, but there are other types of microorganisms that also provide protection, including bacteria that are in the environment, in the soil, in the mud, in the water. And you could imagine if you move from the rural farm existence to a city surrounded by concrete and asphalt and high-rise buildings, your exposure to those types of microorganisms is dramatically reduced, and we think that that is driving some of the increases in inflammation if you grow up in a city. So this is a comparison of 3 different groups of children. The Amish, who have maintained traditional farming practices, working with animals in the field, close proximity to the fields, to the animals. In other words, they're exposed to a very diverse environmental microbial environment growing up. They have the lowest risk of allergies and asthma. If you compare this group to the Hutterite children, they come from a common background in Switzerland, but they've, at least in the US, they've adopted modern farming techniques, including the use of tractors. They have a higher rate of asthma and allergy compared to Amish children, but not as high as non-farmers. And so if you grow up in a city, you're not farming, you have the highest risk. So birth order is important. And whether you grow up in a city or grow up on a farm or in a rural area is also important. This is to bring us back to mental health. This is a meta-analysis, so this is what's called a forest plot. You really don't need to look at the trees, you want to look at the forest. And what the forest is telling us is that overall, all the studies that have compared the incidence of mood disorders of individuals that are living in rural versus urban environments find that there is a higher incidence of mood disorders when living in urban environments overall. So we wanted to kind of test the hygiene hypothesis in the context, not of allergy and asthma, but in the context of mental health disorders. And we know that psychosocial stressors in the workplace, in the home, are important risk factors for subsequent mental health disorders. And the prediction here is that not only would we find increase in baseline inflammation, but we'd also find increases in inflammatory responses to psychosocial stressors that we know are driving these types of mental health conditions. And so we designed a study to look at 20 young German men, 24 years of age on average, that had grown up on farms that had farm animals in close proximity to farm animals, and compared those 20 healthy young men to 20 healthy young men that grew up in cities of over 100,000 people and did not have pets. And so what we're doing here is trying to create a modern urban environment with limited exposure to environmental microorganisms and including bacteria. And then we brought them into the lab, and they were exposed to something called the Trier Social Stress Test, or the TSST. It was developed in Trier, Germany. And it's one of the most stressful things that we can do to a human in a research laboratory that's ethical. So essentially imagine, coming into the clinic and you have to stand up and give a speech about your dream job in front of a camera, and scientists sitting at a table at the front of the room in white lab coats. And the scientists are trained not to smile, not to nod, not to provide any positive feedback whatsoever. And that type of environment where you're being evaluated is very stressful for all of us. There's also a very complicated mathematical task which very few people can do successfully. And overall, this is one of the most potent ways to induce neuroendocrine stress response, an autonomic stress response, your fight or flight response, and also an immune stress response. So you may not know that when you have a psychological stressor, a third component of that stress is activation of the immune system. In other words, increased inflammation and circulation of these inflammatory agents throughout our body. And what we found was that individuals that had grown up in cities, when they're exposed to this type of test, have a massively exaggerated pro-inflammatory immune response compared to the individuals that grew up on farms in the first 15 years of life. This is despite the fact that individuals that grew up on farms reported feeling more stressed and more anxious. So those that grew up on farms reported feeling more anxious and more stressed, but those that grew up in cities have this kind of silent stress response. In other words, you don't go through a public speech like this and think, oh my goodness, my inflammatory response is raging. You have no idea what it's doing. It's not something that we're aware of, this immune response. But that's what's going on in the background all the time, and it's exaggerated if you grow up in a city. We think that that increases the risk for development of these types of psychiatric disorders. And so this is just showing one of the pro-inflammatory molecules that's released during this stressful experience, and you can see that this pro-inflammatory response is prolonged, and there's a failure to recover in an appropriate period of time. This slide is just to point out that we believe there's an association between physical health and mental health, particularly in the context of inflammation and particularly in the context of autoimmune disorders. And so this study showed that individuals with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD are much more likely to go on and develop an autoimmune disease. And here we're talking about any autoimmune disease. And autoimmune diseases that alone were significant include inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, thyroiditis. But the point here is that this suggests that individuals with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder have the inability to shut off inflammatory responses regardless of what type of genetic predisposition they might have to a particular autoimmune disease, which is consistent with the idea that inflammation is one of the risk factors for psychiatric disorders, including depression and PTSD. Okay, so here's a little cartoon from a paper that we published over 10 years ago. And you can't see this in the back, but really what it's showing you is that my colleague Graham Rook has identified these beneficial bacteria or microorganisms as old friends. And he's called them old friends because they have co-evolved with us, humans and mammals before humans, in a way that is designed to interact with the immune system, which is what you see here, to induce what are called regulatory dendritic cells, which bias the differentiation of our T cells toward a regulatory and anti-inflammatory phenotype. So this is just to point out we know something about the biology of what these bacteria are able to do, how they're able to induce anti-inflammatory responses as opposed to pro-inflammatory responses, and consequently prevent this inappropriate inflammation. If you don't have these old friends, then you have a higher risk for development of inflammatory disease. So who are these old friends? They include the old infections. None of us want old infections. But they have this uncanny ability to terminate inflammation, and that's part of why they're successful as pathogens. In other words, they are infectious, like tuberculosis, but they have a highly developed ability to suppress inflammation and therefore to persist for long periods of time in the human host. And of course, during the human hunter-gatherer period of our evolution, the types of pathogens that were successful were pathogens that could persist for long periods of time in the host without killing the host, which would allow that individual to interact with another tribe, transmit the infection to another host, and therefore persist. There's also environmental saprophytes. These are the organisms that live off of dead and decaying organic matter in the mud, the water, in the soil. If you live in a city, your exposure to these types of organisms is also reduced. And thirdly, the focus of today's talk are what are called commensal organisms. In other words, our microbiome. So they live in us, on us, and have a symbiotic relationship with us. In other words, we provide benefits to them. In other words, we feed them, and they provide benefits to us, which part of which is their ability to control inflammation. Okay, how about the microbiome-gut-brain axis in health and disease? So the next question you might have in your mind is, what's a healthy microbiome? Because that's what we all want, right? We want a healthy microbiome. And what is a healthy microbiome? There was actually a meeting that was held in Washington, D.C., where they asked this question, what is a healthy microbiome? And their conclusion was the following. Diversity. What does that mean? Diversity, in its simplest level, is the number of different species of bacteria that you have in your microbiome. The more you have, the healthier you are. Think about it this way. Think about an Amazonian rainforest with its incredible diversity. Compare that to a monoculture of wheat in a wheat field. If we want to keep the wheat alive, we have to add pesticides, fertilizer, herbicides. And even then, sometimes we fail to create a healthy crop. The rainforest, on the other hand, gets along just fine without us. That's a healthy ecosystem. The other thing that they identified in this meeting was the idea that the microbiome is really an ecosystem. And it's the functions of the microbiome that are important, many of which may have redundant contributors. So in other words, you don't need a particular microbiome. You don't need a particular probiotic to have a healthy microbiome. You need a diverse microbiome to have a healthy microbiome. So I thought I'd take a photo of my breakfast. That's my breakfast this morning. And what I'm showing you is breakfast with 30 different plants. Why plants? Why a high diversity of plants? The reason is because even a 3 to 4 leaf spinach plant has over 800 different species of bacteria living inside the plant. You can't wash them off. They're living organisms just like we're living organisms, and they have their own microbiome. So when you eat a plant, you're eating a microbiome, and the more plants you eat, the more diversity you have, and we believe the healthier the outcome. So how do you make a healthy microbiome? Feed it a forest. If you think about forests, you don't have to have a particular forest to have a healthy forest. You don't have to have every tree to have a healthy forest. You have to have some trees, but you can have different trees. And you certainly don't have to have all trees. So if we do a quick calculation on the back of the napkin, 30 plants, 1,000 microorganisms or bacteria per plant, 30,000 different species in one meal, perhaps. So these are data from the American Gut Project, which was conducted by Rob Knight and his colleagues, who was here at CU Boulder, but now he's at UC San Diego. And this was over 10,000 individuals that were analyzed for the composition of their gut microbiomes. And what they found that the main factors driving the diversity of the gut microbiome, apart from what time of year they collected the sample, what plates they used for their robots to do the sequencing, etc., were these two questions. One, the frequency of eating plants, and two, the number of different plants that the individuals ate. So I think we're running out of time, so I just want to mention the idea of nutritional psychiatry. This is a very exciting new field in psychiatry, and it's based on the observation that through a number of studies that have been included in this meta-analysis, whole dietary interventions that replace unhealthy foods with healthy foods are able to decrease depressive symptoms in people that don't have depression, but importantly also decrease depressive scores in patients that have a diagnosis of depression. So simply improving the diet improves mental health outcomes. This is to point out that the microbiome-gut-brain axis is a bidirectional axis. I don't want to go into all the mechanisms involved other than to point out that it involves our endocrine systems, our immune systems, and our nervous systems, and there are signals going in both directions. So future directions, I just highlight this project by Binks Selby and Linda Fong. Some of you may know Binks and Linda in Patagonia, Arizona. And they've set up a program for seniors with senior lunches. They charge $5. And Binks asked his chef to make sure there's at least 30 different vegetables at every meal. And anecdotally, what the participants are reporting is improved symptoms of physical disorders like diabetes, so physical health, improved social functioning, social health, and improved mental health, which according to the definition of the World Health Organization, is health. So thank you so much for your attention.
Chris, just want to thank you so much. I wish we had time for questions, but we don't. But it's a fascinating topic. And in your honor, Boulder Rotary will contribute 100 doses of polio vaccine to our Polio Plus Fund. And so that makes 200 kids that are going to get vaccinated because of your good work and
thank you so much.
being with us. Thank you.